crypto maybe being in its collared shirt era, where we're definitely not wearing a suit to work every day yet, but we've definitely left mom's basement.
Hello and welcome to Fortune's Crypto Playbook. I'm finance and crypto editor Jeff John Roberts.
And I'm Fortune reporter Ben Weiss.
We got another fun show this week. Happy to say we've got Guy Wuollet, a partner at a16z Crypto. Always interesting to see what Andreessen Horowitz is up to. We haven't checked in for a while, so looking forward to that interview. And meanwhile, this week, of course, brings more news. The big one that dropped this week is Tether. They finally did it. Did you see that, Ben?
They said, a big four audit firm has agreed to work with them, which has been the big sticking point for Tether for the past, I don't know, probably since they ever started. Jeff, you've been reporting on Tether probably since they first launched back in the mid 2010s. So this is a big news for Tether and also for the industry because it gives them much more legitimacy, I think, in many people's eyes.
Yeah, definitely. As you point out, this has sort of been something that's been floating out there forever. Why doesn't Tether get an audit? Tether, of course, is the biggest stablecoin player. And, it's always been a bit of a trust us thing. And it's when I've talked to Tether over the years, they're like, no, the big four, of course, we're talking about like Ernst & Young and PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, those folks who go in, and having a big four audit is kind of the, a final stamp of approval that your books are legit. And Tether has always been, sort of dancing, saying, well, they're not ready to do it. They don't have the capacity. And then heard from other people, it's like, no, Tether doesn't want to do it. Raising the question of, are all those stablecoins really backed as they say? And this, I think, kind of puts it to rest. In my big Tether feature earlier or late last year, I said on balance, yeah, it's probably there, but it wouldn't hurt for them to show it. And they've finally done that. But as you point out, the details are a little scant. Which big four firm and when are they going to publish it? But, I do think it lifts this cloud over the industry because in terms of existential risks out there, I think things that would just blow all of crypto up would be, some compromise in Bitcoin's core code. Or I do think Tether being found to be unsolvent would blow a, existential size hole because Tether is just so ubiquitous.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say is that they haven't done the audit yet. So we don't know if, we don't actually know what the reserves and everything looks like and whether it kind of corresponds there. They've been releasing these attestations. Curious to see when they publish the audit and who is the auditor.
Yeah, okay, stay tuned for that. What else do we have in the week's news, Ben? Our resident scoop machine. I like that bit you got on Kalshi and Polymarket. The two bitter rivals, the CEO of Polymarket and Kalshi, got together to do what?
As people know, Kalshi and Polymarket, two of the biggest prediction market platforms. The CEOs, they've kind of either implicitly or explicitly have taken pot shots at each other, but they have both come together to invest in this up-and-coming prediction market VC fund called 5cc Capital. It's founded by two former Kalshi employees, and the name actually references like a kind of obscure statute in the Commodity Exchange Act, this bill that was passed in the 1930s. It's an interesting story, and it's weird to have a prediction market focused VC. Like, are they gonna have enough things to invest in? It's a burgeoning industry, but curious what startups are out there that they find kind of worthy of putting millions into.
Yeah, well, I mean, every week a new pitch crosses my desk of, prediction market for this or someone for private shares, which is kind of interesting. I mean, this fund here is 35 million, which is pretty puny for the venture capital world. But the interesting parts are that, those two guys, Tarek and Shane, who by all indication don't like each other, are able to invest together in this industry, which is sort of interesting. So I think that's the interesting element there, and just to see what happens next. The other thing too I thought was interesting is once upon a time, like you kind of built your company and you took it public, and then you started dabbling in VC stuff. It feels like these guys have just been on the scene for like, a hot second, and now they're doing the venture capital thing. It just feels like everything in tech is so much more accelerated than it used to be, but this is the time we live in.
I don't know how much money they have, but they must be kind of rolling in it, even though, there hasn't been an exit yet for Polymarket or Kalshi, either through an IPO or cryptocurrency launch for Polymarket. But I guess maybe we'll see more prediction market funds in the upcoming year.
Of course, the wild card in this too is the sports too. Another big prediction market headline is there was, I think the Journal noted there's a bipartisan bill to, force them out of sports events contract game. Did you catch that
Be
story?
careful, Jeff. You got to be careful about
Mm.
your semantics here.
Yeah, it's not gambling, it's events. But what do you think is going to come of this?
You know, I think it's interesting to see that there are two that there's bipartisan legislation being introduced. The big question is what will happen during the midterms. I don't see a bill getting passed like this before the midterms, but if the Dems win, Congress back, I'm curious whether this bill will get pushed through. But on the other end of things, the GOP, the CFTC, for example, are big backers of Polymarket and Kalshi. Donald Trump Jr. Has a role at both companies, either as an investor or advisor. I see that there's probably going to be political pushback against this bill from a lot of GOP leaders and others, because this would take out a huge chunk of Kalshi and Polymarket's volume.
Yeah, and not just GOP. I think AOC, the young Democrat firebrand, who I don't usually see eye to eye on a lot, I think did put out a pretty astute tweet about the kind of social harm that can come with widespread gambling to families and to young men and stuff like that. As listeners know, I think it's a free country. If you want to do this, do it. But some of this, I don't know if we should be cheering. But as you point out, it's a midterm year. I think it's not that hard to get a bipartisan bill together. But having it pass is another story, and I don't think that's going to happen. There's not much is going to pass, period. And also, both of these firms have got big allies in the Trump family. I think Don Jr. is on one of their boards and is an investor in the other. So someone explained it to me about a year ago, saying, while this stuff is bubbling around in court, it's probably going to be settled, in the political scene. And I think as long as his White House is in power, these guys don't have much to worry about.
Yeah. But going from political scenes to more sceney vibes, what did you think of the Vanity Fair photo shoot of all these crypto power brokers?
Oh yeah, this was this sort of like a bit of catnip in our crypto Twitter feeds last week. I wrote about it for the newsletter too. It's interesting just how the broader perception of crypto, which has never been great, but there's this Vanity Fair shoot all over our timelines where it was, who was there? It was Mike Novogratz and Kathy Wood and Olaf Carlson Wee, and a few others, Danny Ryan, the longtime Ethereum guy, and they were, all sort of dressed up in, goofy, expensive outfits in this very Baroque ballroom, posing as, and I think the headline was, "These people want to be taken seriously," and it was clearly kind of like a bit of a sort of snide, sniggering shot at them. But the actual article wasn't bad, but it did raise questions of, does the media hate crypto, and also, what were you thinking? And to me, what I wrote is like, what did you think is going to happen? It's called Vanity Fair.
Yeah.
This is what they're going to do. But human nature is what it is. I mean, Vanity Fair shoots, like President Obama and Sydney Sweeney. And if they called me up, even if I thought they'd probably make a fool of me, and, be kind of be like, oh, Vanity Fair wants me in a photo shoot. It's a sort of invitation. It's probably very hard to take note, to turn down. Did you have any thoughts on it?
Look, I thought it was funny. I'm all for like a silly article. I think the funniest part actually was Hayden over at Uniswap was asked to do it, and he put out a tweet about this. But when he was asked to be in the photo shoot, originally they told him that it was going to be, I think, at a spa or a bathhouse, and he was going to have to wear a bathrobe. I was like, if you're a comms person and like someone comes to you and says, hey, like we're gonna put your CEO in a bathrobe, like. I don't know why you would say yes to that, but hey, I thought it was amusing.
Yeah, it is. It's it is what it is. It's fun, and also comms people too. I'm not usually out here like endorsing comms people, but I spoke to one of them. The main comms person for one of the people in the shoot, who told me that their person had just went and did it and said after the fact, oh, I had an interview with Vanity Fair today. And that's one of those things, and they were one of the people who looked quite foolish in the shoot, and the PR person said correctly. I mean, if these people are paid a lot of money, if you have a PR person listen to them. Final note on that shoot, though, I do think the amount of shade thrown at Devin Finster, both in the article, which actually wasn't bad, it was a decent history of crypto, and from the other people there who were talking smack about Devin, and he's this sort of almost this like John Lennon, Yoko Ono situation where he had this older girlfriend partner who insisted on being in the shoot with him, and called Devin her Build-A-Bear and stuff. It was really strange, but he was, I think, cast both by the others in the shoot and the article itself as this kind of like Johnny come lately weirdo grifter more than the other ones were. But that's just the only people that find this interesting is probably deep crypto insiders like us.
The one thing is that like the photoshoot wasn't actually crypto's biggest power brokers. There was no Brian Armstrong, there was no one from Binance, and I think that's something to think about, is that like OpenSea was like the big company of yesteryear, but they're not the same as they were in 2021 and 2022.
Yeah, they rounded up who they could get, and the reality is these are people who were early, and because of that, they're really rich, and they also have time on their hands, who seem to give themselves over to like a lifestyle more than actually building anything, but like to carry on that they are kind of like the Elon Musks of the era. But you're very right. Like the major players, Armstrong should have been there, Vitalik should have been in there, Paulo from Tether, and all these people either don't have time to like swan around a ballroom getting their photo taken for Vanity Fair, or just have the judgment to not put themselves in the firing line like this. But it made for an amusing couple hours on crypto Twitter, which is always looking for diversions. On a somewhat more serious note, not great on the company front. We've had layoffs at crypto.com, not huge, maybe 12%, but that followed big layoffs at Gemini and at Masari. And that also came with, I think, Kraken announcing that they're putting their IPO, not announcing, but someone, I think CoinDesk found out, they're going to put their IPO on ice for right now. What does all this add up to, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, props to CoinDesk for breaking that scoop. It is, I think, a weird time for crypto. The idea of the crypto winter, this bearish and bullish cycle that goes back and forth, is something that people have touted and used as kind of like a frame to talk about crypto's history. Prices are down, but also it seems like there's a lot of wind in crypto sales. So I think kind of the TLDR, the takeaway from this news, is maybe this is just companies trying to adjust for prices. But Kraken's, the report said Kraken was pausing his IPO and hadn't taken the IPO off the table. So maybe they're waiting for kind of things to change in a macro sense before they're going. I don't know. Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, an IPO is all about timing. It's like, kind of be able to tell a story, and you have to look at, because you have to put all your books out there. And if there's signs of recent decline, which presumably there are, because crypto's had a bit of a slump. Kraken, I think, though, is built for, legit life as a public company. Some of the other ones there who ran out, again, it's all about timing. This time last summer, a bunch of companies that should never gone public went out there because the markets were frothy enough. People would buy their shares. And I know I pick on Gemini on the show, but, they were losing money when they went public, and there's never, been a real kind of raison d'etre for them. They've always been a kind of also ran. And that was, they only exist because the Winklevoss brothers have got, unlimited money to keep funding it. It just sort of seems like as a vanity project, there's got to be cheaper ways to do it than kind of running around with a public company. I think they could get into like art or fine dining or buy a restaurant or something like other people do. It'd be less work if they're looking for status, but here we are.
I would, it sounds great to me.
Yeah, well, you went into journalism, Ben. You know what you're signing up for too. Maybe I'll be able to take you to McDonald's next week. We'll see. So this would be a good time to pivot to our interview. I'm delighted that we have Guy Wuollet. He's kind of an emerging star at Andreessen Horowitz Crypto, which of course is one of the big dogs in the world of crypto venture investing. Let's turn to Guy. Guy Wuollet, welcome to the Fortune Crypto Playbook. It's your first time on. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You've been at a16z Crypto for 3-4 years now?
It's a little bit more than 5, but time flies when you're having fun. And especially in crypto, it feels like the decades are compressed into weeks. So it's been a fun experience.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. One thing I'm curious about, the other thing in crypto is, too, the narrative seems to shift so quickly, and it feels like we're in another kind of inflection point going in a new direction. There's sort of a debate currently. I know, you're Chris Dixon
Mhm.
the head of your firm there, made a big case for the read write web era of the web. There's been some pushback, some people saying no, crypto is more financially rooted. I mean, it's never entirely one thing or the other, but I'm kind of curious where it's going right now within the firm. What do you see the direction? Are we in the finance era? And is there something else that's bubbling up we're going to see soon?
Yeah, I think we are in a finance era. Chris wrote a book called Read, Write, Own, which was trying to articulate kind of the first version of the internet was about reading information. The second version of the internet with things like social networks was about writing information, and that the modern version of the internet was about ownership and about things like capital markets or property rights. And I think we've seen that play out over the last couple of years. Certainly, there has been, I think, less adoption of crypto consumer apps than we were hoping for. But if you look at all of the fundamentals, things like stablecoin adoption and payment volume, which is decoupled itself from underlying speculative exchange volume, something we treat as a real positive and an indication that we have real product market fit for stablecoins. I think that's been an incredible sign that the crypto is moving in the right direction. A lot of the regulatory and policy shifts in the U.S., things that we've been fighting for years. The stablecoin bill passed with Genius, and I think we're very optimistic about Clarity. That's been a real improvement. And then I think we've started to see, in the last year, and it's given me a lot of optimism personally, people leaving finance roles and, coming from Wall Street to start building on chain, especially at the intersection of, what we would call DeFi or decentralized finance historically, and, more traditional financial applications. I would say those two markets are annealing a little bit, where much of traditional finance and fintech is reshaping itself a little bit to come on chain, especially for the efficiency and composability benefits. And much of crypto is really, reshaping itself in many ways to become more palatable and attractive for, those more traditional financial applications. So I would say we're kind of crypto is growing up in many ways, which is wonderful to see. And we often talk about crypto maybe being in its collared shirt era, where we're definitely not wearing a suit to work every day yet, but we've definitely left mom's basement and are kind of growing up. And so I take that as a real positive sign moving forward. And I think to your question, we're definitely in a bit of a financial era where crypto is moving mainstream.
Yeah, the collared shirt era, I like that. And I couldn't agree more too. And I think pointing out too that the amount of people coming in from traditional finance shops like, maybe Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan and stuff, whenever crypto hits a slight bump and oh my God, the price of Bitcoin's been down for a few months, people proclaim it's all going wrong. That's something I like to point to, because a few years ago, the amount of people coming in from companies like Google and Facebook and the tech giants, now you're seeing, people, these are very smart people, and people don't bet their careers on technology typically unless there's something there.
100%.
Tell me lately, what are you most excited about? What's, we know some things that, didn't quite come, the consumer side hasn't come together yet. I mean, it might one day, but right now, what are you most excited about? What do you think is going to be the big thing in the coming year or two?
Yeah, I think there are two things we see. The first is this process of fintech really transforming into crypto and crypto transforming into fintech a bit. The first applications and adoption we've seen there has largely come around stablecoins, with things like neobanking in the developing world and B2B payments in the developed world. I think a lot of that shift was a result of the passage of Genius, the result of a regulatory shift. I think in the fullness of time, that will be actually a small fraction of the full market. And if you look at how traditional finance works, payments and consumer banking is a very small fraction of the financial world as a whole. And so we've started to see companies that are more focused on things like exchange or lending, back office infrastructure for finance, really starting to work within crypto as well. And that dovetails a little bit where we've had a lot of positive regulatory shifts just from the agencies today, more around things like securities law clarifications, and obviously the Clarity Act we're very optimistic about it in DC. And so we think about that as unlocking a lot of the rest of the market for on-chain financial use cases. And then I think there is a pretty significant overlap between crypto, AI, and robotics. And I think maybe that will look like for this era, kind of cloud, mobile, and social. And we've started to see a lot of people very interested in agents. I think agent is probably the most common or popular keyword that we hear in discussions with founders and entrepreneurs these days, which gives us a lot of excitement. And I think the simple way of phrasing that, we can definitely talk more about it, is that if you believe in an agentic world where there are lots of agents making, economically meaningful transactions on our behalf every day, then you kind of have to believe in either literally DeFi or something that looks a lot like DeFi itself. You need to believe in a financial system where agents can participate, fairly and equitably. And I think unintentionally, likely, crypto has built that over the last few years. So we've seen, a number of really talented people coming from kind of the consumer AI use cases into crypto because in many cases they think the first agentic payments will happen on chain. And you can even see this from bigger companies like Stripe that I think spent a large portion of their annual letter a few weeks ago talking about agentic payments. And certainly, you hear that when you talk to people that work there as well.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. I wrote about recently in response to a Wall Street Journal piece that I thought was quite astute, saying that, the big companies like, Circle, Coinbase, Stripe, and so on are looking for a role for stablecoins domestically because, they've sort of proved themselves as, a way to exchange money across borders. But solving a problem near and dear to my heart, which is micropayments, because being in media, I've long wished we had micropayments. But this idea of maybe like paying for like data or API calls, having your agent do it with mini amounts of stable coins. And that I find really compelling. But is this something that's actually going to happen? What's the timeline? Is this something that's going to happen like by the end of the year, or is this still a 5 years out sort of thing?
I think like anything, the discussion and the theory always comes ahead of the implementation. So no, I don't think this will happen overnight. But I do think the drastic shift from most people interacting primarily with search engines to interacting primarily with LLMs has created a question or a challenge for the internet's business model. Historically, that business model was you create content that drives clicks and attention, and you can monetize that via advertisements. If today I'm not, clicking on a website anymore because I'm simply asking my LLM every morning, like, tell me what the news is, that obviously puts into jeopardy a lot of the business model of the existing internet. And I think, as you were saying, a really good solution to this would be agents making very small micropayments to content creators or to, sources of traffic, and then having those micropayments fan out to the content creators themselves. And so I think that's probably too elegant a solution, the way I'm describing it, for it to be, literally implemented that way. But we have started to see a number of big companies that are very interested in that. And I've always wanted micropayments to work. I think they were challenged because humans are not very good at making individual purchasing decisions, and reducing churn is was a significant project of Web 2. But if we now give agents a budget and allow agents to make purchasing decisions according to some policy, a set of approaches that I think crypto serves really well, my hope is that will unlock a lot of use cases and will kind of help to put the business model of the internet back on the solid footing.
Yeah, I've long wished our browsers like, Chrome or Safari had like a little wallet where we could kind of just, tool around the web and pay for stuff, but it just never came together. But I think in the LLM era, just maybe it will. And I think that would be so cool because the technology is there. I think, agents plus stable coins, it could be a big unlock. My one concern though, Guy, is tell me about this. For this to work, we need interoperability and sort of standards. And, the reason the web works, of course, is, protocols that are universal and can be used anywhere. How is that going to shake out? Because I know MoonPay and Base and others have just announced a consortium to kind of standardize this, which I think is super exciting. However, for this to work, you need, everyone to play. And there's been some talk too that Stripe is so big, they want to kind of make the Tempo blockchain kind of a semi-proprietary thing. Is this a concern? And how soon will we know whether we're going to have the equivalent of a like email protocol or the long lost 402 protocol, whether that's going to be here or if it's going to be another Tower of Babel for finance?
Yeah, I think like any process of standardization, you often have, there's the old XKCD comic of you have 12 standards, so we need to propose one to unify them all. Now you have 13 standards. I think we're going through that process a little bit right now, to your point. That's certainly true. I think having a single unifying standard is probably less important today than it was 25 or 30 years ago, because LLMs are so good at understanding syntax and writing software. It's probably okay to have a bunch of different standards that are inherently open, even if they do not interoperate with each other natively. I'm pretty personally optimistic that any software that exposes APIs will be very composable in the future. And then I think there are a number of open standards that we're really excited about. I've spent a lot of time recently. We invested in a company called Merit Systems that's launched an MCP integration for X402. And now it's, very easy when I'm talking to Claude to ask it to, for example, enrich queries about like, please find me these 5 people's emails, or, I'm really interested in this new category. Who are the top founders there? What are their emails? How can I reach them? Those sorts of use cases, I think, have become really simple to implement. And, to your point, there are many different ways, many different standards, and perhaps some of the bigger players are thinking about embrace, extend, extinguish. I would be pretty skeptical that that's possible in a world where agents are writing more and more of the software, and it's really easy to comply with and integrate with new standards. So I think it's a question of how it plays out, but I remain pretty optimistic.
Yeah, I think you said something shrewd too, that with LLMs, these are like a lot smarter. And if they come across sort of a fractured landscape, they'll be able to solve it. There's a metaphor that Brian Armstrong at Coinbase told me about a year ago. I really liked the idea of AI agents running around with little crypto purses. I don't know why it stuck with me, but I'm going to add a new sort of layer to that. Just pretend that person running around is C3PO, who can translate anyone, they encounter, and that would be an enormous sort of unlock too. So yeah, it's kind of exciting. I think you're right. We might avoid that predictable sort of, fault line if that happens. I'd like to pivot sort of to a more personal level quickly. And one is, you mentioned you use Claude. I'd like to just very quickly tell me, in your day-to-day work and personal life, to what degree is AI a part of it? I'm sure it's a huge part of it, but specifically, like, what tools are you using for what and how?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time with ChatGPT and with Claude. I think it's been a really nice shift now that when I have technical questions or sort of minute questions that might have annoyed a founder previously, we would have had to literally ask them every single question about their business and take up a lot of their time. It's much easier today to get a pitch deck from them or get a memo and then have a discussion with an LLM and an agent, trying to quickly learn about the business and market that they're building in. In fact, many of the founders we've talked with recently actually send us like markdown files that are intended for ChatGPT or intended for Claude, where they're like, you should, instead of reading my deck, you should have a discussion with an LLM about the business that we're building, and I want to give the LLM context. So I think that's been really nice. And then it certainly helps to automate the process of, I think, doing any knowledge working email job to a great extent. So I get to spend a lot less time in our kind of internal systems keeping track of data, which is wonderful. And I think it will probably continue to have a pretty significant effect. The effect, I think, is more significant if you're writing software all day. I at one point was a decent engineer, and I'm certainly not an engineer anymore. But I think talking to the companies that we work with and invest in many cases, a majority and a large majority of the code being written is done by agents. And I think that's obviously the most significant shift, and has been a big shift even in the last 6 months, where everyone that was even slightly skeptical, I think, has totally found religion about that. So I would say that's the biggest difference in our business.
Yeah, that hadn't occurred to me. That's a good point too. As a VC, a lot of the grunt work, there's less of it. You just deploy the LLM and you can work on the bigger ideas, which is I assume the fun part of your job. And finally, Fortune speaks to a lot of leaders, and including sort of young emerging leaders. And my final question for you is this: you're in a sort of storied firm with some very big, names like, Chris Dixon, Mark Andreessen, which, you're human, and to a degree that must be sort of intimidating coming into that at first. By now, hopefully not. But what's your sort of advice for someone in your role, who arrives in that sort of setting? How do you show yourself as a leader, and how do you kind of find your role with a lot of sort of, very, big names all around you?
It's a good question. You're asking me to do introspection, which Mark has just talked about on Twitter for the last week as like the worst idea possible. In fact, you should not introspect at all. I think I maybe introspect slightly more than not at all. We spend a lot of time focusing on working with the best people and supporting the best entrepreneurs we can. I would not presume to give myself advice. I would, kind of just focus on our work every day. And I think my mom stuck with me and repeated all the time when I was a kid, stick to your knitting. And that is very much, my approach to work and to life, just to try to do a really good job every day and bring an optimistic and positive attitude.
So know what you're good at and believe in yourself.
That's a much better way of saying it.
Love it. Yeah, no, the introspection thing too. I think I don't know. I suspect even Mark might be a little more introspective than he lets on, but it is niche, and he's very good at also too throwing those ideas out there and stirring it around and see what comes back. Anyways, Guy Wuollet, thank you so much for joining our show.
Thank you for having me.
So Jeff, what did you think about your interview with this new young gun over at a16z Crypto?
Well, he's not that new, and I thought he had some thoughtful things to say. That one that struck with me. It's nice when they throw out a nice turn of phrase. He said that crypto's in its collared shirt era, which I think is absolutely correct. Given all the stuff with Wall Street right now, and I thought too he was fairly thoughtful and somewhat candid about the juxtaposition of basically the read-write web era, or read-write own. I'm sorry, that was the big book a couple years ago with Chris Dixon. This prediction there'd be all these consumer-facing apps and social, and we'd be doing everything on crypto, and it just didn't really happen. And instead, all the action has been stable coins and tokenized stock and RWAs and that stuff. So I think he acknowledged that pretty candidly, which was good to hear. And the other really interesting part I thought was on agentic commerce. And in response to my question of, is there a risk that with everyone building their own thing, Stripe over here and Base over there, that we could kind of have a Tower of Babel for crypto? And his response was, AI agents are smart enough to be able to, if they encounter, an unfamiliar protocol, they can just go figure it out. And, it's, as I said, it's almost like having like C3PO, as your translator navigating the web. But you got a lot deeper computer science background than me. What do you think? Do you think there's a risk of a fracture of different protocols halting the adoption of crypto payments?
For crypto payments, I think that has been like the big question, right, in crypto. That there's all these different chains and all these different databases and all these different ledgers, and can we make systems that kind of all play nice with each other? And isn't it kind of crazy that we have like 150 different blockchains? All of these, do we really need a new different chain, a new different protocol? And maybe that same kind of thing is playing out now. I guess on the other side of everyone launching all these protocols and chains is that it's like, well, let's just see which one works, and we're going to throw a lot of stuff, and I'll just kind of reset that. But yeah, I think all of these people are probably just wanting to experiment with a lot of different things and see, which one works, and, and all power to the ones that win. I think my biggest thing with agentic payments more generally is that where is it right now? It's kind of this vision of the future, but it hasn't really kind of shown in any meaningful way on the either consumer side or on the enterprise side.
Yeah, it's early days though. I also wrote, a few weeks ago that, there was a time when Amazon, home deliveries, it was really novel. You might have a friend who ordered a book from Amazon, and that was a crazy thing. And right now, yeah, it's the amounts are pretty small. And who knows? I'm not saying this will work for sure, but I'm really intrigued with the idea. If there's devs out there and you need to make an API call or, license a data library to have agents and go out there and make micropayments, seems really intriguing to me. I just think payments on the web have been broken forever. It's one of my hobby horses. I think in media too, I'd love to have a thing where there'd be sort of a dynamic wall. I hate paywalls. And if there could be something where the agent could basically broker a deal to read a one-off article, that might be a business question as well. But I think the promise here is huge. But you're right. It's not for sure it's going to take off. And also sometimes these things are right in theory, but take 5 years. I guess we'll see. Anyways, lots more to watch on the crypto scene. Well, Ben, I think that's a wrap. To all our listeners, a quick programming note. This is the end of our current season, but we'll be back before too long. Thanks as always for listening. I'm Jeff John Roberts.
I'm Ben Weiss, and we'll see you next time.